Hello, everybody. My name is Simon Allison. I am the Africa editor for the Mail and Guardian newspaper and editor of The Continent, the Pan-African weekly news magazine. I am speaking today to Frans Timmermans, the European Commission's Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal. Mr. Timmermans, welcome. Now, Vice President Timmermans, we all know that the climate crisis was not caused by African countries. The continent only contributes around 4% of global carbon emissions. What is Europe's responsibility when it comes to helping Africa to cope with this crisis?
Well, I think, first of all, our two continents are Siamese twins. If Africa does well, Europe will do well. If Europe does well, it can really provide some support for Africa as well. If Europe suffers, it will not be focusing on the importance of working together with Africa. If Africa suffers, the problems will come to Europe without any doubt. So the sooner everybody understands this, the sooner we can find solutions. Now, what I've seen over the last year is really a change of heart on both sides. I think finally, the Europeans are getting rid of their paternalistic attitude towards Africa, because I see everywhere we're looking at African plans. We're not bringing plans to Africa. Secondly, even though Africa isn't responsible at all for the situation we're in, Africa's already experiencing the consequences of that situation. So I think there's a huge also global responsibility, but also specific European responsibility to help Africa with mitigation and adaptation in this climate crisis that already has huge effects. Look at the droughts, look at the storms, look at the weather that has become completely unpredictable, look at the locusts infestations we've had in Eastern Africa. So yeah, that's where we need to be partners. And secondly, apart from adaptation and mitigation, it's about time that every young African, wherever they live, had access to the internet, had access to electricity, and that can only happen if we embrace the idea that we can decentralize electricity generation, bring it to villages everywhere. And for that, you need renewable energy. For that, you need solar power, you need wind, you will need hydrogen at some point. And also in all these things, we can work together, and specifically on South Africa and a number of other countries, you need to wean yourselves of coal, which is going to be a huge challenge as well.
Absolutely. How do you respond to the argument that, well, Europe was able to benefit from very cheap fossil fuels for decades to fuel its growth, and Africa should be allowed to do the same thing?
I think Africa has a huge opportunity with its young and vibrant population to leapfrog over a number of developments and to at least avoid some of the worst mistakes we made in Europe over the last 150 years. So if you first create a bigger dependency on fossil fuels, to then have to wean yourselves from that is more difficult than to immediately try and embrace new forms of energy. And I'm more and more enthusiastic about what I see in Western Africa, in some countries, in Eastern Africa. I was in Ethiopia earlier this year, and also there, the understanding that you can have villages with their own power generation based on solar and wind is bringing it's also a form of emancipation, and it's also a form of bringing more social justice also to remoter areas and countries.
Mr. Timmermans, you have been leading efforts to introduce a Green Deal in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about what this might mean for Africa?
I think it would mean that you bring new forms of energy generation or upscale them. The potential for solar energy in Africa is huge. Don't have to explain that. The potential for carbon sink, through your natural environment, through forests and grasslands, etc., is also huge. Potential because we also have a biodiversity crisis. We're losing 1 million species if we're not very careful. The potential for Africa to contribute to our biodiversity resilience worldwide is huge. We need to stop deforestation of primal forests in Africa. That's of huge importance. But especially the potential for younger people to learn trades, to study, to be part of an economy that's going to be extremely vibrant is huge. Africa has such potential. And the Green Deal is a growth strategy. It's not just about tackling the climate crisis. It's also about bringing about new forms of economy, circular economy, no longer based on fossil fuels, no longer based on wasting commodities, but rather on recycling and on reusing, etc. And for Africa, this has a huge potential. You know, recycling and reusing is not something most Africans are unfamiliar with.
How, when you have these conversations with other African leaders, how receptive are they to these kinds of ideas?
Well, I think that what's driving this, I think, frankly, is worries about climate change, which I see have increased exponentially in most, if not all, African countries. Secondly, they see economic opportunity, given the fact that we're also in an industrial revolution. And as I said before, Africa would have the possibility to leapfrog over a number of stages in our economic development if it is done right. Thirdly, I think what really is important to note is that more and more European countries are not talking to African countries by saying, we know what's good for you, but saying, we're listening to you. How can we help? How can we be part of this? Because we see opportunities for us as well. And then, of course, there's also the elements that I really welcome in an increasing number of African countries, the societal structures we have in Europe, the rule of law, freedom of the media, a vibrant NGO community, things that especially many young Africans aspire to as well. And if politicians have any sense, they would cater to those aspirations rather than suppress them.
There was a major vote in the European Parliament to cut carbon emissions by 60% by the year 2030. First of all, congratulations, that's a major accomplishment. But what we have seen already is that, when confronting carbon emissions, some companies choose to simply outsource those emissions to other parts of the world. How are you going to prevent European companies and countries from simply outsourcing their emissions to Africa?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised this, because this is a trap we should avoid. We've seen it before with waste, with plastics. We get rid of our problem by bringing that stuff elsewhere, and we should avoid this from happening here. This will depend a lot on the strategic partnerships we want to develop with African countries. It would also depend a lot on the behavior of private investors that we can influence. So how can Africa contribute to this? I think to look very much at governance, at investment protection, at working together with us to make sure that we can attract investment. And also we should address the issue of global corporate governance with a lot of force. If Europeans get all worked up over deforestation in Africa, in Latin America, they should all get worked up as well about who's responsible for this. And sometimes the responsibility lies with the European companies. So we also have an issue to tackle here of corporate responsibility. And I hope we can convince the majority in the European Parliament and in the Council to hold our companies accountable for this. And if they don't, if they're not accountable, that would have consequences for their cooperation and their support in this transition.
So just to clarify, will you be pushing for legislation that specifically regulates the way that companies behave in other parts of the world?
Well, first of all, I think this should be part and parcel of any trade agreements we sign with other parts of the world. Secondly, I think this should be part of the strategic agreements we reach with the African Union and with individual African nations. Thirdly, I think corporate governance internationally should also be part of the proposals we make for legislation in Europe. And I know my colleagues are working on this. We've been working on this in the past, but we need to improve that. So I think on all these levels, we can make sure that we don't have these negative consequences that are indeed a trap we should avoid.
I want to get onto the issue of migration. Of course, we know that there has been a wave of migration from African countries to Europe, driven at least in part by changing climate conditions. We've seen the conditions in camps like Moria in Greece. We've seen the boats left to drown in the Mediterranean. At the same time, you've had instances of Europe giving money to dictators like Omar al-Bashir to try and prevent migration from occurring. In this context, how can we trust Europe to do the right thing?
Well, I think the only way we can actually come to solutions that are effective, but also morally acceptable, is when we address the root causes of all this. Once young people have paid smugglers in their home countries and are on their way and risk their lives in the Sahara or elsewhere, and then risk their lives again on sea, it's in fact already too late. The only way we're going to solve this is if young people have enough confidence in their own futures in their own countries, that they don't feel the need to migrate. Or when they feel the need to migrate to work in Europe, that we have a legal system whereby they can apply for visas in a way that is realistic, in a way that gives them an opportunity to come to Europe. And I think only if we do that can we find solutions.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but we've got countries like Italy and Greece, which have taken a very hardline approach to both refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants, arriving on their shores. How are you going to get them to toe the line?
Well, first of all, we need to be fair to those countries. For many, many, many years, they've had a very liberal, very open attitude to refugees. And then, of course, because of the war in Syria and because of other reasons, they were at some point overwhelmed. They asked their European friends to help them and got very little, almost no response. And at some point, they started to wave through these migrants and refugees. And then other countries in Europe accused them of not following the rules, which they didn't, but they had asked for help for such a long time. So the problem here is, in essence, a problem of moral hazard within the European Union. European nations who don't trust each other. Some nations who think they are doing too much. Other nations are saying, yeah, I'm not at the border, but all these refugees end up in my country, although I'm not at the border. And also a third group of nations who say, we can't be bothered, you're on your own, we're not helping. And all of this has contributed to a very poisonous cocktail of moral hazard in Europe. And the ones who pay the highest price in this context are the refugees and the migrants. So that's why we're trying to change that paradigm, to come up with ideas, realistic ideas about shared solidarity, about sharing the burden, but also realistic solutions to provide clarity in the shortest possible time to people who present themselves at European borders demanding asylum, whether they have the right to that asylum or not.
What are some of those solutions?
As I said, if we don't talk about tackling the issue at the source, we'll not succeed. So we need to do everything we can to provide more opportunity in African countries themselves. Sometimes countries grow very quickly, but then the economic growth falls into the hands of a very, very small elite, and even very well-educated young people feel cut out of their own society. So they look for opportunity elsewhere. And this has to change. I mean, I think there's probably very few African leaders who don't understand that they need to change this. So where we can contribute through an Erasmus program, which offers higher education, through training on the spot, through other means, through investment, as I said before, to create a better opportunity, I think this is what we should be doing. But once people do come to Europe, we need to have procedures in place, and that's what the Commission has proposed a couple of weeks ago, that would offer, especially from those countries people come from where we know they will never have the right to asylum because they don't flee from war or natural disasters, that they get clarity very quickly, because now they can just play the system very often, sometimes even for years, coming from countries where we absolutely know they have nothing to fear, and still they can, if it gives them 2 years in Europe, that they can work illegally, etc. For 2 years, those are, for young people, these are at least 2 years they're not starving, or they're not in dire straits. And even if at the end they're then sent back, sometimes, I think only 1/3 of the people are actually sent back who don't have the right to asylum. So that's part of the system. That's the thing. It sounds very harsh, but I know Europe really well. I think I can say that if we don't make the distinction very clear between those who deserve to be protected and those who don't, then we will not protect anyone, because then our population will say, well, if you can't make that distinction, we will not accept anyone. And then people who actually flee from persecution or war will be refused asylum in Europe. And that would be then we take leave of our most fundamental values. But we're not a long way from there if we don't fix the system.
Mr. Timmermans, thank you very much for a very interesting and engaging interview.
It was my pleasure. Well, I really hope South Africa will be doing extremely well, and I miss it, and I hope to be back soon as we can travel. And all the best to you and to your loved ones, and stay safe.
And to you, and I hope to see you here in this country sometime soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Have a lovely day. Cheers. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.